In the heat of a collapsing border and a nation drowning in overdoses, a new kind of war was declared. Not in the shadows, but in the open seas and skies of the Caribbean. For the first time in history, American forces were ordered to hunt cartels like enemies of the state. In the first months of 2025, a shift began that would redefine the boundaries between law enforcement and warfare. It started quietly inside secure rooms in Washington, where intelligence reports painted a growing map of chaos spreading from Latin America into the United States. Fentanyl deaths surged past historic highs, overdose numbers climbing each week, and southern border agents reported a flood of synthetic drugs unlike anything before. The networks traced back to the cartels, fragmented, decentralized, and heavily armed. They were no longer operating as simple smugglers. They had evolved into transnational syndicates with private armies, drone capabilities, and digital laundering routes that reached across continents. Donald Trump, newly reinstated as president, had made a promise during his campaign to end what he called the drug invasion. His advisors drafted a plan that blurred the lines of traditional law enforcement and military strategy. In March, the National Security Council approved a reclassification of major cartels as terrorist organizations. This move opened legal channels for direct military intervention. For decades, the war on drugs had been fought through agencies, DEA, FBI, Homeland Security, but this time the Pentagon would take the lead. The cartels, in Trump's words, were to be treated as unlawful combatants. Within weeks, the United States Southern Command began mobilizing. Naval fleets were repositioned into the Caribbean under Operation Sentinel Tide. Satellite surveillance expanded over Venezuela, Colombia, and the Mexican Gulf. Drones began tracking small vessels moving from the Orinoco Delta toward Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. Intelligence identified one network, the Venezuelan-based Tren de Aragua, as a growing hub of synthetic drug operations. It had already expanded into Chile, Peru, and Panama, creating smuggling corridors that bypassed Mexico entirely. For the administration, it became the first target. The order came down in early April. The U.S. Navy, operating from a carrier strike group anchored east of Curaçao, launched precision attacks on 2 vessels believed to be transporting narcotics and weapons tied to the Venezuelan syndicate. The strikes marked the first official military engagement under the new directive. 11 suspected traffickers were reported killed. The White House confirmed the operation within hours, calling it a necessary step in dismantling narco-terror networks. The message was clear. The United States was no longer policing drugs. It was at war. The announcement reverberated through global media. In Caracas, Nicolás Maduro condemned the action as a violation of sovereignty, accusing Washington of manufacturing an excuse for aggression. Russia and China expressed concern at the United Nations, warning that the move set a precedent for unilateral intervention. Inside the U.S., the reaction split sharply. Supporters framed it as a long-overdue offensive against a threat that had killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. Critics argued that the declaration blurred constitutional limits, bypassing Congress and transforming a domestic crisis into an international conflict. But the machinery of war had already been set in motion. Intelligence agencies coordinated with military units in ways unseen since the early days of the post-9/11 campaigns. The CIA provided target lists, NSA intercepts mapped communications between cartel financiers, and special operations teams were placed on standby in undisclosed Central American locations. By June, the Pentagon confirmed that Task Force Orion, an integrated command of naval, air, and cyber elements, had been activated under Southern Command Authority. Its mission was direct interdiction of cartel infrastructure, wherever it operates. The maritime operations expanded rapidly. Coast Guard cutters armed with advanced radar and drone support intercepted dozens of fast-moving narco-subs, low-profile vessels designed to evade detection. Each carried tons of synthetic opioids, often disguised as industrial chemicals. The Navy reported a 30% rise in encounters within 2 months. Drug seizures climbed, but so did resistance. Several interdictions resulted in firefights on open waters. Intelligence briefings revealed that certain cartel factions had acquired military-grade weaponry from black markets, once linked to Eastern European conflicts. In response, Trump authorized expanded engagement rules. Naval commanders were granted discretion to neutralize hostile vessels without prior approval, when evidence suggested cartel affiliation. The move was unprecedented in anti-narcotics history. It effectively militarized the high seas in the name of drug enforcement. Within weeks, media outlets broadcast footage of explosions off the Venezuelan coast, nighttime strikes captured by reconnaissance drones. The administration presented the footage as proof of decisive action, framing each destroyed vessel as a victory in an ongoing war that, for decades, had been fought only in silence. Behind the scenes, coordination with regional governments grew tense. Colombia, an ally long dependent on U.S. aid, expressed concern about operations creeping close to its waters. Mexico's leadership condemned the militarization, warning that it could destabilize already fragile border regions. Yet internal intelligence from both nations confirmed cartel movement northward, as military pressure intensified in the Caribbean. Convoys shifted routes through Central America, using jungle trails and abandoned airstrips. The DEA's role changed dramatically. Once the leading agency in counter-narcotics, it now worked as an intelligence auxiliary under military command. Field officers embedded with naval units and surveillance aircraft, transmitting real-time data from radar feeds to operational hubs in Florida. By late summer, over 50 coordinated strikes had been reported across maritime zones, including the Gulf of Honduras and the waters west of Barbados. The Pentagon claimed the operations had disrupted hundreds of millions of dollars in drug shipments. Inside Washington, debate hardened. Legal scholars questioned the definition of armed conflict used to justify the strikes. The administration cited the 2001 authorization for use of military force, arguing that terrorism now included non-state actors conducting transnational threats. The Justice Department prepared memoranda asserting that cartels met the criteria of hybrid armed groups. The shift effectively moved the war on drugs into the same legal framework once used for Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Public support fluctuated. Polls showed a divided population, one side praising the aggressive posture as a sign of strength, the other warning of endless escalation. Yet the visual power of the campaign, the footage of missile launches, intercepted boats and uniformed officers addressing press briefings, dominated headlines. The narrative of war against the cartels became part of national identity once again. As autumn approached, operations moved inland through covert partnerships. Intelligence from the Defense Intelligence Agency pointed to clandestine airstrips in Venezuela's Bolivar region and clandestine labs in Panama's Darien Gap. Special reconnaissance units, operating under classified programs, began conducting surveillance missions with unmanned systems. Rumors circulated of cross-border incursions to destroy drug stockpiles. Officially, no such missions were acknowledged. But satellite images released by independent analysts showed scorch marks and destroyed infrastructure, consistent with precision airstrikes. International pressure mounted. The Venezuelan government demanded UN intervention, alleging that the US had violated its territorial integrity. Washington maintained that all targets were in international waters or ungoverned zones. In diplomatic cables leaked weeks later, US officials described the strategy as containment by demonstration, showing overwhelming force to deter future smuggling. At the same time, intelligence reports highlighted internal shifts among cartel hierarchies. With key maritime networks disrupted, trafficking routes realigned toward overland corridors in Central America. Guatemalan and Honduran authorities reported a surge in convoy movement and border skirmishes. The vacuum left by destroyed fleets was filled by smaller, more elusive operators. For every vessel neutralized, several others appeared, adapted, and dispersed. By November, U.S. naval presence in the region reached levels unseen since the early 1990s. Carrier groups patrolled both Caribbean and Pacific approaches. Maritime patrol aircraft flew constant rotations from Puerto Rico and Panama. In Washington, the Department of Defense released partial figures. Over 100 maritime interdictions, 76 confirmed vessel neutralizations, and thousands of pounds of seized narcotics. Trump held a press conference standing beside military leaders, declaring the campaign a success. He described it as the first phase of a larger global operation to eradicate cartel influence. Behind the public statements, internal reports painted a more complex picture. Supply chains had been disrupted, but violence across Latin America intensified. Retaliatory attacks struck local police units and ports cooperating with U.S. forces. Venezuelan state media broadcast footage of destroyed fishing villages, alleging civilian casualties. Independent investigators struggled to verify the claims. The administration maintained that all targets were military in nature and linked to drug trafficking. The Pentagon's strategic assessment concluded that the campaign had achieved operational dominance in maritime zones, but warned of potential escalation if land-based targets were pursued. Trump, during a televised address, hinted that operations could expand beyond the seas. He stated that American forces would not hesitate to strike wherever these killers hide. The statement set off waves of speculation about possible incursions into Central or South American territories. Inside the National Security Council, planners began drafting contingency outlines for limited ground operations. The proposed framework mirrored earlier counter-terrorism campaigns, precision raids supported by air assets, conducted in coordination with local allies. The documents, classified at the highest level, described potential targets including high-value cartel leaders operating under Venezuelan and Colombian protection. Throughout December, naval deployments maintained pressure. Drone surveillance identified new smuggling methods, semi-submersibles with stealth coatings, disguised fishing vessels transmitting false registration codes. Intelligence estimated that despite the strikes, cartel profits remained resilient, adapting to the new threat environment. The U.S. continued to portray each interception as evidence of progress, emphasizing deterrence over eradication. In early 2026, the United States confirmed the establishment of a permanent maritime command post in Puerto Rico, dedicated to anti-cartel warfare. It integrated naval intelligence and law enforcement assets under a single chain of command. The post symbolized the transformation of drug enforcement into a long-term military enterprise. Recruitment expanded, budgets increased, and defense contractors began supplying specialized detection technologies and maritime drones. The line between domestic security and foreign combat blurred further with each passing month. Foreign governments remained divided. Some quietly cooperated, offering intelligence in exchange for aid. Others denounced the operations as violations of sovereignty. The Organization of American States convened emergency sessions, but consensus was elusive. The U.S. maintained its stance that the war on cartels was not a choice but a necessity. Inside military briefings, the term narco-theater replaced drug route. The Caribbean and Eastern Pacific were mapped like war zones, color-coded by risk and operational frequency. Special Operations Command expanded its presence, training new units in maritime interdiction and low-visibility infiltration. Missions once classified as anti-smuggling now fell under counter-combatant operations. By mid-year, global reaction intensified. European allies expressed unease, fearing that the precedent of unilateral military action against criminal organizations could spread. Latin American nations faced economic turbulence as trade routes tightened under American surveillance. Oil shipments from Venezuela slowed amid heightened naval scrutiny. The region's geopolitical balance shifted under the weight of U.S. presence. The administration, however, projected strength. Trump addressed the nation from the deck of an aircraft carrier anchored off Key West. Behind him, the Atlantic shimmered with naval silhouettes. He declared the fight against the cartels a defining struggle for civilization itself, a war not only against drugs, but against what he called the machinery of human destruction. The crowd cheered, and cameras captured the spectacle for broadcast around the world. In Washington's corridors, advisors prepared the next stage, expanding from maritime enforcement to territorial denial. The plan envisioned partnerships with regional militaries to destroy cartel infrastructure before shipments reached the ocean. The groundwork was being laid for a conflict that no longer resembled the old war on drugs but something far larger, more permanent, and far more dangerous. ChatGPT said, "The second phase began under the same doctrine that had guided the early strikes, but with a larger scope and deeper reach." Intelligence analysts from the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA compiled a network map that stretched from the Mexican Pacific to the jungles of South America, showing not only smuggling routes, but financial structures, encrypted communications, and front companies in Europe and Asia. The cartels were now described as a hybrid system, capable of financing militias, bribing local governments, and sustaining production even under bombardment. Reports indicated that high-ranking figures had moved operations inland, away from maritime zones, protected by rural militias and local political shields. By February 2026, the National Security Council authorized covert joint missions with regional allies. These operations aim to sever logistics chains before shipments reach the coast. The first joint mission was launched in cooperation with Panama and Colombia, using U.S. satellite imagery and reconnaissance drones to locate hidden airstrips near the Darien Gap. Over 3 days, coordinated strikes destroyed multiple runways and depots used for storing precursor chemicals. Local officials announced dozens of arrests, while American briefings described the raids as precision operations targeting the core of cartel infrastructure. The strikes demonstrated the new phase of engagement: direct intervention without formal war declarations, operating through bilateral agreements and covert authorizations. In Mexico, intelligence reports indicated that remaining major cartels were shifting toward alliances, forming temporary truces to resist the new external pressure. Communications intercepted by the NSA suggested meetings between former rivals seeking to coordinate logistics and defense strategies. The Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels, once mortal enemies, appeared to share smuggling routes and distribution hubs to sustain operations. This unification drew the attention of U.S. intelligence planners, who warned that the concentration of power could evolve into a regional insurgency. In April, U.S. reconnaissance satellites detected unusual movements along the Pacific coast of Guatemala. Heat signatures indicated new construction sites believed to be chemical production facilities. Special reconnaissance units were deployed under joint authority to verify the targets. Within weeks, footage confirmed industrial-scale activity hidden beneath jungle canopy. Trump's administration authorized a limited operation under the codename Iron Passage. The U.S. Air Force launched a series of precision strikes using drones and long-range cruise missiles, coordinated with Guatemalan intelligence. The operation destroyed 3 primary targets and disrupted dozens of transport convoys. The Pentagon announced the success in a brief statement, describing the campaign as a surgical response to ongoing cartel expansion. As these operations intensified, diplomatic friction escalated. Mexico's president condemned the strikes as an overreach of American power, while Colombia sought to balance cooperation with public neutrality. Venezuela accused the United States of waging a proxy war under the guise of drug enforcement. Russian state media amplified the accusations, framing the campaign as a strategic maneuver to expand U.S. military presence in Latin America. Inside the UN, multiple delegations called for investigations into the legality of unilateral drone operations across sovereign territories. The U.S. delegation defended the campaign by invoking self-defense under international law, arguing that the transnational nature of cartel networks justified preemptive measures. Throughout 2026, the Department of Defense published intermittent progress summaries. Maritime seizures had reached record highs. Cartel-linked assets worth billions were frozen, and over 200 maritime vessels were neutralized. Yet intelligence continued to report resilience within the networks. Smuggling tactics evolved rapidly, with cartels adopting drone-assisted deliveries, underwater transport pods, and autonomous maritime craft guided by satellite coordinates. Naval patrols found increasing evidence of remote-controlled vessels carrying synthetic drugs packed within ballast tanks. Each adaptation forced new countermeasures. In August, Southern Command launched Operation Thunder Veil, designed to dismantle digital communication channels and money laundering frameworks sustaining cartel operations. Cyber units from U.S. Cyber Command infiltrated encrypted financial systems linked to Panama-based shell companies, freezing millions in assets. At the same time, coordinated arrests targeted financial brokers across Miami, Madrid, and Panama City. The Justice Department described the operation as a landmark success, revealing how cartels had merged with global financial structures. The dismantling of these systems exposed connections between organized crime, offshore banking, and legitimate corporations acting as intermediaries. Despite the publicized victories, field intelligence painted a shifting landscape. Reports from Honduras and Nicaragua indicated rising instability, as smaller factions competed for territory abandoned by major cartels. Local militias armed with surplus weapons filled the void, turning trafficking routes into battlegrounds. American advisors stationed in neighboring countries warned that dismantling established cartels had fractured the criminal ecosystem, creating unpredictable violence beyond state control. The Pentagon increased humanitarian funding for displaced border communities while continuing air surveillance across the region. As autumn approached, U.S. forces maintained constant operations from Caribbean bases. The Naval Command Post in Puerto Rico became the epicenter of coordination, integrating surveillance feeds, satellite intelligence, and real-time analytics. The facility operated around the clock, directing both maritime intercepts and inland reconnaissance. Analysts observed patterns of cartel adaptation that mirrored insurgent tactics from earlier conflicts. Groups adopted decentralized communication, encrypted channels, and compartmentalized logistics cells to prevent total collapse. American strategists began describing the conflict as a hybrid war, part military campaign, part intelligence operation, part law enforcement effort. In late October, a major confrontation erupted in Venezuelan waters. A U.S. Navy destroyer intercepted a convoy of vessels believed to be carrying armed escorts for a shipment linked to Tren de Aragua remnants. The exchange escalated when one vessel opened fire. The ensuing engagement resulted in multiple explosions, igniting oil slicks and debris across the sea. Venezuelan authorities claimed the U.S. had attacked civilian vessels. Washington responded by releasing infrared footage showing armed men and weapon mounts on deck. The incident deepened tensions between both nations, pushing regional diplomacy toward crisis. Behind the scenes, intelligence assessments revealed growing cartel cooperation with foreign mercenaries and weapons suppliers. Arms shipments traced to Balkan and African networks reached Latin America through clandestine routes. Analysts concluded that certain factions were attempting to militarize beyond smuggling operations, adopting strategies similar to paramilitary organizations. The Pentagon responded by expanding aerial reconnaissance coverage and deploying additional drones equipped with long-range sensors. Surveillance intensified across the Yucatan Channel, where activity suggested preparation for renewed maritime trafficking. In December, the administration authorized the deployment of advanced maritime surveillance aircraft along both American coasts, integrating data with domestic agencies. The goal was to track the full logistical chain from production to distribution within the U.S. Interior. Homeland Security and the Department of Defense established a joint operations center to fuse intelligence between domestic law enforcement and overseas military efforts. The Fusion Center marked the final convergence of internal and external fronts in the war on cartels. By early 2027, the scale of the campaign had expanded globally. Interpol coordinated with U.S. intelligence to pursue financial networks in Europe and Asia. Hong Kong and Dubai, authorities seized accounts suspected of laundering cartel profits through cryptocurrency exchanges. In South America, joint task forces uncovered new chemical labs deep within rainforest territory. Protected by armed groups loyal to displaced cartel factions, U.S. satellite surveillance confirmed hundreds of hectares of coca and synthetic chemical operations relocated into protected zones. Environmental satellite data showed increasing deforestation, a collateral effect of the drug trade's migration deeper into remote regions. Throughout the year, U.S. forces maintained their operational tempo. Maritime task groups intercepted record shipments, but each success revealed another adaptation. Intelligence reports described cartel leaders forming temporary alliances with insurgent groups to secure territory. In Colombia's borderlands, U.S.-backed forces encountered militias blending political ideology with narcotic enterprise. Analysts warned that the conflict risked merging organized crime with local insurgency, blurring definitions between political rebellion and trafficking. The White House maintained its stance. Trump continued to portray the war as an essential struggle against a global criminal machine undermining civilization. Public addresses emphasized American resolve, citing casualty statistics and seizure data as evidence of progress. In parallel, humanitarian aid to Latin American states increased, funding infrastructure reconstruction and law enforcement reform. Yet violence persisted, spreading unpredictably as smaller cartels competed for dominance. In May 2027, intelligence pinpointed a significant meeting of cartel leaders in the Colombian borderlands. The location, a compound hidden near the Guaviare River, was identified through intercepted communications and drone reconnaissance. Operation Silent Current was approved, a coordinated multinational strike involving American air power and Colombian ground forces. The raid commenced before dawn, lasting 40 minutes. Multiple structures were destroyed, and several high-value targets were confirmed dead. The success was announced by the Pentagon within 24 hours. It was presented as a decisive blow against organized cartel leadership, signaling the decline of coordinated transnational trafficking. However, the aftermath revealed new challenges. Intelligence soon indicated that surviving mid-level commanders had divided into autonomous cells, continuing operations independently. The fragmentation accelerated violence across Central America. Regional governments faced destabilization as armed groups multiplied beyond control. U.S. strategists recognized the evolution of a conflict that could no longer be defined by singular organizations. The cartels had dissolved into a network of smaller, fluid entities, harder to track and impossible to negotiate with. The Department of Defense restructured its approach, transitioning from concentrated strikes to sustained containment. The focus shifted to intelligence dominance, cyber infiltration, and maritime blockade. Naval deployments became semi-permanent fixtures in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. Drone patrols operated 24 hours a day, tracking every vessel departing high-risk zones. The conflict entered a steady state, less visible, more enduring, and integrated into the architecture of national defense. By late 2027, the geopolitical consequences had reshaped Latin America. Trade routes adjusted under U.S. scrutiny, and governments aligned policies to avoid sanctions or military pressure. In Venezuela, the economy continued to contract amid sanctions and surveillance. Regional blocs debated whether U.S. actions had stabilized or destabilized the hemisphere. Yet the data on overdose deaths in the United States showed gradual decline, attributed by officials to the disruption of maritime smuggling routes. The administration cited the numbers as validation of the campaign's necessity. Intelligence reports from the field told a more intricate story. Synthetic drug production had partially shifted to Asia and Africa, beyond the immediate reach of U.S. military presence. Networks once centered in Latin America now extended through transcontinental corridors. Maritime seizures decreased, not from eradication but redirection. New trafficking pathways emerged through commercial shipping and digital currency laundering. The conflict's center of gravity moved overseas, and planning began for broader coordination with European and Asian partners. In January 2028, Trump authorized the creation of the Global Narcotics Warfare Command, integrating foreign intelligence partnerships and extending operational jurisdiction beyond the Western Hemisphere. The command unified cyber, naval, and intelligence elements under one doctrine. Its mandate described the fight against narco-terrorism as a global campaign requiring persistent surveillance and kinetic capability. For the first time, the war on drugs had become institutionalized as a permanent branch of military strategy. Inside the Pentagon, analysts prepared long-term projections. Simulations suggested the conflict could last decades, driven by economic demand and technological adaptation. Yet the administration viewed permanence as stability. The command structure ensured continuous readiness, funding, and intelligence sharing among allies. By mid-2028, joint operations with European naval forces patrolled transatlantic routes once used for smuggling. Africa saw the emergence of small-scale interventions targeting methamphetamine production centers tied to displaced Latin American networks. Domestically, the campaign reshaped the political landscape. Federal funding redirected toward defense-based counter-narcotics reduced resources for civilian programs. Ports and border facilities transformed into militarized zones, monitored by radar and aerial drones. Coastlines once dominated by trade vessels now hosted surveillance ships and interceptors. Civil liberties debates intensified, but failed to reverse the tide of policy. The nation had adapted to a state of permanent external engagement against an ever-changing adversary. By late 2028, casualty reports from Latin America indicated over 10,000 deaths attributed to combined cartel violence and military intervention. The region faced economic stagnation and social displacement, while traffickers relocated operations to regions less affected by U.S. reach. The balance between eradication and escalation remained delicate. Each successful strike carried the risk of creating new factions, each more elusive than the last. In Washington, planners assessed achievements in statistical terms: reduced maritime flow, increased interdiction success, and controlled domestic supply. The administration framed the results as a transformation of global order, describing the cartels not as defeated, but contained. The new military infrastructure stood as proof of American dominance over unconventional warfare. The Caribbean fleets, the surveillance networks, and the cyber divisions became permanent instruments of policy. Through the following year, the global landscape of narcotics shifted again. Synthetic drug synthesis in Asia replaced the cocaine networks of the past. Cartels evolved into multinational partnerships, operating through encrypted digital platforms. The war's front lines dissolved into cyberspace and transoceanic logistics. Yet the physical presence of U.S. fleets remained, a constant deterrent to resurgence in the Americas. As the decade neared its close, historians and intelligence officers alike recognized that the campaign launched in 2025 had redefined the meaning of warfare. The classification of criminal syndicates as armed belligerents had established new precedents in international law and military doctrine. The machinery built to fight them became a fixture of the modern state, outlasting its original purpose. What began as a reaction to crisis had evolved into a global structure of perpetual vigilance. In the final months of the administration, as reports circulated of declining drug flow but rising global instability, military planners briefed Congress on the continuity of the campaign. The war, they said, had entered its sustained phase, managed through surveillance, deterrence, and readiness. The ships remained on station, the drones in constant orbit, and the command centers alive with the pulse of data. The war on cartels had become not a conflict of years, but an institution of power, reshaping borders, alliances, and the very idea of peace.